Today, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration plays a number of important roles, from weather forecasting and severe storm warnings to fishery management and supporting maritime commerce, which affects about a third of the U.S. gross domestic product. But NOAA and its Uniform Commission Corps have a long history that includes a critical but little-known role played during the largest conflict in human history. The vast, vital, unsung but often heroic contributions of the members of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, a predecessor to the modern National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, during the Second World War, deserve to be remembered. The U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey began as the United States government's first scientific agency when it was created by an act of Congress in 1807 as the Survey of the Coast. It became the U.S. Coast Survey in 1832 and the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in 1878. Throughout the 19th century, the ships of the U.S. C and GS were crewed by Navy personnel, and both ships and personnel were usually transferred away in time of war. It wasn't until 1900 when an appropriation law provided funds for all necessary employees to man and equip the vessels. In the wars of the 19th century, civilians of the survey still served aboard Navy vessels and with ground forces, but did so at increased risk because they were civilians. Under the laws of war, they could be tried as spies if captured. With the entry into World War I in 1917, the Coast and Geodetic Survey Corps was created so that if personnel were captured, they were legally protected as combatants. The Survey Corps also simplified the deployment of survey experts in wartime, and while survey expertise might seem trivial for combat, it is anything but. During the First World War, over half of the commissioned officers were transferred to the armed services, such as the Army and the Navy, while the U.S. C and GS ships like the Surveyor, Pioneer, and Guide were transferred to the Navy during the war. Coast and Geodetic Survey officers assisted in mine-laying projects in the North Sea, as intelligence officers and even on the staff to General Pershing. The surveyors and other officers did considerable work for the war effort, producing maps and surveys for the Army, Navy, and Signal Corps. In 1918, they produced over 237,000 charts. They also completed hydrographic projects for the Navy, such as wire drag surveys in Long Island Sound and in the York River, and did surveys to assess naval fire control experiments and speed trial courses. They also did surveys of the Virgin Islands, which were bought from Denmark in 1917, Florida Reefs, Cape Cod Canal, and others to meet the needs of the Navy Department. In the interwar years, the survey returned to its peacetime work, but would be asked to serve their country again after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. And again, over half of the commissioned officers in the Coast and Geodetic Survey Corps were transferred either to the Army, the Navy, or the Marines, and around half of the civilian workforce joined the armed services as well. Those that remained on the home front worked almost exclusively on war-related projects as well. They often served in frontline positions as artillery surveyors, hydrographers, amphibious engineers, beachmasters who would direct disembarkation, and a variety of other technical positions. Civilians produced more than 100 million maps and charts for Allied forces during the war. Before the war, the agency produced about 800,000 nautical and aeronautical charts of United States areas, but during the war, production vastly expanded. And in 1944 and 1945, the agency produced 13.5 million charts a year. 4 million charts of foreign areas were produced in 1945, and the agency produced around 6 million special charts annually. Target charts were especially important, and 1,800 different target charts were prepared, largely for the Army Air Force. Around 2 million copies of target charts were produced in 1944 of targets like Romanian oil fields in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. According to a post-war history with the Department of Commerce, in 1939, a stacked pile of the paper charts would have reached about 335 feet. In 1945, a pile of charts produced would be 5,990 feet high. When the Army Air Force opened the Army Air Force Aeronautical Chart Plant in St. Louis, the first commanding officer was an officer of the Coast and Geodetic Survey. There was good reason to need those charts. Many of the charts in the Pacific were many decades out of date. The Navy had 2 survey ships in commission, the Bowditch and the Sumner, and 6 of the Coast and Geodetic Survey's 9 survey ships were transferred to the Navy, including the Pathfinder, Oceanographer, and Hydrographer. 2 ships called Pathfinder participated in the war. The first entered service in 1899 and was renamed the Research in 1940. It informally belonged to the Philippine Insular Government in 1941, although it was crewed by the Coast and Geodetic Survey. The ship was performing surveys in the Philippines, including near Bataan in the days immediately before the war. And according to the ship's commander, Edward Ted Morris, a launch near the ship was hit with a bomb that set fire to the ship. Although the fire was controlled, the ship eventually sank and was finally beached off the coast of Bataan. The survey had been highly active in the Philippines, and numerous personnel were stationed there. Commander George D. Cowie was head of the Philippine Coast Survey, and when the Japanese invaded, faced some difficult decisions. The surveying and printing equipment could be valuable to the Japanese, but just as importantly, as Ted Morris said, the Coast Survey had the only copy of the Nautical Almanac in the Philippine Islands for the coming year, and duplicates were being made for the Navy. On December 24th, Commander Cowie was retrieving those copies when a Japanese bombing run destroyed the building he was in, and he was killed. Morris got a small printing press and plates onto a barge, which made it to Corregidor, where the Americans were holding out, but the barge was lost with the press before they could use it. Instead, the survey made maps by making blueprints. You just had to have a few chemicals and paper, Morris recalled, to assist with the war effort. Morris and several other officers were captured, along with multiple family members, and were imprisoned for the duration of the war. Lieutenant Joseph Warren Sterney was imprisoned as a civilian, but eventually revealed he was a uniformed officer and was transferred to a POW camp. He was killed aboard a Japanese transport, Hell Ship, at Takao, Formosa on January 9, 1945, when Allied planes bombed the unmarked ship, killing around 400 POWs. The second Pathfinder was christened even before the loss of the first. Built for the C&GS, she was transferred to the Navy before she was completed. Pathfinder surveyed and fought in the Pacific for the entire war. Surveyors often went ashore before amphibious landings to lay out charts on coastlines like New Caledonia, Guam, and Guadalcanal. Around 50 bombing raids threatened the ship, and at Guadalcanal she shot down 2 enemy planes with anti-aircraft guns. On May 6, 1945, a Japanese kamikaze plane struck the survey ship, killing 1 person. Pathfinder received 2 battle stars for her service. According to NOAA, it was said that the road to Tokyo was paved with Pathfinder charts. The Explorer had just completed operations at Midway and was sailing for Johnston Atoll on December 7th, when it first got news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. At sea and basically unarmed, the crew did what they could, improvising 2 depth charges out of TNT. They also pulled out emergency weapons, 6 .30-caliber rifles and 2 pistols. Still, as the report later said, the means available for defense were not hopefully regarded. Worried that Johnston Island was compromised, they set course instead for Honolulu. Multiple planes were observed. As they approached Hawaii, they found an American seaplane which had run out of fuel and rescued the occupants. They reached Oahu on December 10th, safely. The Explorer spent most of the war doing survey work near Alaska. In June of 1942, Japanese forces occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. The C&GS had been surveying Alaska for years, and in 1935 had a 9-lens, state-of-the-art camera designed for aerial photography, designed by O.S. Redding. The camera weighed 750 pounds, fully equipped, and used 23-inch wide film. Using a Coast Guard Catalina PBY purchased specifically for the job, the plane was crewed by the Coast Guard, with C&GS Corps officers assigned as the navigator and photographer. In the summer of 1941, they worked on improving the Alaskan charts. After Pearl Harbor, the PBY was transferred to the Navy, but transferred back to the Coast Guard to continue survey operations in May of 1942. They surveyed from east to west until they ran into Japanese patrols. The PBY crashed on Mount Moffett in July of 1943, killing all but 2 of the crew, including U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey officers Joseph A. Sosby and Raymond B. Elliott. The need for good charts and data only became more important after Japan occupied Attu and Kiska. The hydrographer was sent to survey Attu before the U.S. landed to retake the island on May 11, 1943. After the initial landing, hydrographer continued surveys to find shoals and find safe routes for supply ships. On August 13th, hydrographers surveyed approaches, anchorages, and landings on Kiska, and 2 days later the U.S. landed to find that the Japanese force had fled ahead of them. The hydrographer went on to survey in the Pacific, including at Guam. She was awarded 3 battle stars for her service, and her commanding officer was awarded a Bronze Star for survey work in Alaska. Oceanographer, nicknamed the Green Gremlin and formerly J.P. Morgan's yacht, first headed to the Aleutians, but was an older ship and poorly fit for Alaska work. She served in the Pacific, producing 15 charts, and surveyed the Havana Passage in New Caledonia, at Guadalcanal, and New Georgia. She was decommissioned in September of 1944 and scrapped. Among the important work was the prediction of tides, using a mechanical computer first put into use in 1910, a large machine that uses gears, pulleys, and slides to determine tide calculations for anywhere on Earth. Officially dubbed the Tide Predicting Machine No. 2 and lovingly dubbed the Old Brass Brains, tide prediction was a vital part of operation planning in some of the most important stages of the war. The machine and its tide predictions were integral to the planning of the Normandy invasion, part of the complex considerations that determined the date of the attack. The Allies wanted a day when the low tide fell shortly after dawn, the night after a full or nearly full moon, which required exact and accurate predictions. The same kinds of calculations were made for the many amphibious landings made during the war, like Operation Torch, Operation Dragoon, and landings in the Pacific. Another part of the modern NOAA is the Weather Service, but during World War II its predecessor was the Weather Bureau. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an executive order defined the Bureau's wartime role to provide weather data important to military campaigns. The emergency called for alert and constructive service, which implements meteorological science to do its utmost in successful prosecution of the war, read a circular letter. Weather data had potential military value, and by 1941 the U.S. had already halted meteorological information from getting to London. The Weather Bureau limited distribution of weather and airports, and weather reports were kept out of sight from possible espionage. Weather information to the public was limited to newspapers and telephone and removed from the radio. The Office of Censorship in Washington requested restrictions on what the newspapers could publish, limiting the amount of non-local weather information that could be published, and observations from many states in the western United States were barred completely. Sky conditions and temperature forecasts were not allowed, and changes in temperature could be published in general form only, such as much cooler or little change in temperature. Mention of heavy snow was considered an aid to saboteurs. These restrictions were eased in 1943, but only eliminated after the war ended in 1945. U.S. Weather Bureau personnel served as civilians aboard U.S. Coast Guard ships, such as the cutter Muskeget. 4 men, Luther Brady, Lester Fodor, George Kubach, and Edward Weber, volunteered for duty as weather observer in 1942 and were aboard Muskeget on August 24, 1942, when the cutter departed Boston en route to Weather Station No. 2. From there, the ship sent out coded weather information to Allied ships until September 9th, when the ship went silent. The ship was not found, but German naval records discovered in 2014 revealed that U-755 torpedoed a ship in the same area on September 9th. 121 men were killed in the sinking, 9 commissioned officers, 107 enlisted men, 1 public health service officer, and the 4 civilian employees of the Weather Bureau. 700 members of the Weather Service volunteered to join fighting forces throughout the war. Officers pulled from the survey served in many tactical roles, including as artillery surveyors in units such as the 16th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. In 1939, the U.S. had only 1 complete FAOB, but by the end of the war they had about 25 battalions. A 1948 article from the Field Artillery Journal attributes the success of Allied artillery in large measure to the effectiveness of the Field Artillery Observation Battalions. These units landed with frontline units at every major amphibious operation in Europe. A large part of the 285th FAOB was destroyed at the massacre at Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge. Using sound and flash-ranging devices, these units were instrumental in counter-battery fire and direct artillery fire. Smaller units, sound-ranging platoons, were used in the Pacific until victory in Europe, when battalions began to arrive in the Pacific. The most decorated C&GS officer of the war, Captain David Whipp, served in the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the French Croix de Guerre. He served an astounding 924 days in action across Africa and Italy. After the war, he returned to the C&GS, where he served until his retirement in 1968. Members of the Coast and Geodetic Survey, whether serving with the survey or one of the branches, served their country with courage and distinction. They served on all fronts in a number of roles. A note from Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean Areas, to Rear Admiral H. Arnold Caro, Director of the U.S. C&GS, on the bottom of a photograph of the Japanese surrender in September 1945, stands as testament to the importance of their contribution. With best wishes and great appreciation for the assistance of the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in making possible the above scene. Often forgotten and underappreciated, the work of the Coast and Geodetic Survey was vital to the war effort, and their legacy continues in their modern iteration, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which works not just to keep their memory alive, but to preserve much more history through a number of efforts, including finding and protecting the wrecks of the ships of the Second World War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.